right, so we're broadcasting. Cool. So I wanted to create a quick tutorial on creating Steam VR environments. Um, and I've seen a bunch of tutorials out there for using the editing tools, and I think most of them are outdated. With the introduction of Steam VR Home Beta, some of the ways you manage the files and stuff have evolved just a little bit. The dialogues look different. So I couldn't find a comprehensive tutorial that covered what it looks like today. So I thought I would do that, because I've been having fun creating environments, and I'm completely new to this. I've done 3D design before, but this is obviously a separate tool set. So first thing you want to do is make sure you start up SteamVR. Unfortunately, the headset has to be operating the entire time you do this. So keep that in mind. If you're working on something, you set it down. You might want to save and shut things down so your headset doesn't just run and run. I'm using HTC Vive, first generation, with room scale, and just SteamVR. So the first thing you want to do is, if you click this little drop down on the SteamVR status window, you get a number of options. Workshop is one of them. We're going to create and modify an environment. Now this one's important. These are the workshop tools. You basically want to create an empty add-on. Do not create an add-on from selected or any of the, you don't need any of that. If you do that, you're going to have problems. So create an empty add-on. We're going to call it tutorial. Called tutorial 2 because I've done this entire thing already and it's screwed up. So here we go, create. Now we've got a blank add-on. Click launch tools. So what this is going to do is fire up SteamVR Home. It's going to bring up the asset browser with shortcuts to all of the tools that you can use to manipulate the mesh and geometry, models, and materials, etc. So the first thing we want to do is open up Hammer. Hammer is the editing tool that you use to create map geometry and basically a compiled level to use with SteamVR. So we're going to start in Hammer by saying File, New. It's going to create a new empty map. When you start out, it's going to look something like this. We can minimize this. One thing I will say, do not close this window and do not shut down SteamVR while you're doing this, or it will close all these editing tools and you'll lose your work. So just minimize them and be conscientious of that. So when you fire up this editor, you're going to be kind of overwhelmed with the buttons and fladens and windows that are here. Things that are really important: this is your primary view space where you can edit and create. This secondary window, you can pick your isometrics. You can do a recreation of this as well. But to maintain perspective, as you create stuff, you can use these to help you with alignment. You can see what the lighting looks like without lighting, etc. But that's your main view window. So right-clicking here allows you to manipulate the view space, just like you would in a first-person shooter, up, down, left, right. And then you can use WSA and D to travel inside this space. Right now it's empty, save for the grid. So one of the first things you want to do when you're creating an environment is to create some geometry. So we're going to come over here to this toolbar and click the block tool. And then on the grid, we'll left click and drag, and it's showing the dimensions of whatever object you're instantiating in this world. This one's 128 by 128. The grid is set to 64, so it's 2 units. You can see it snaps to the grid by default. The world scale in the Hammer engine seems to be between 12 to 18 units, represents about a foot. But that's less critical. It's not a super precise engine in terms of rendering distances and stuff. It's really, you're going to have to play with it, a little trial and error, and you want to scale your world to match the height approximately of the character that you're going to place in it. So we'll start with 128 by 128. We can change and scale this later. Once you create this geometry, you'll notice it says press enter here to complete the geometry. So this geometry is still flexible, still movable. These widgets here with arrows show you how you can resize and change this geometry before you commit and create it. Okay, so we're going to size this. We'll make it a little bit bigger. We'll make it approximately 10 by 10. Get it close to that. And then just hit enter. And so now we have this solid cube thing. Okay, that's pretty cool. What do we do with it? Well, one of the concepts you have to get used to with Hammer is, yeah, you can make a box, right? We could throw a player on here and then your world's a box. But if you want to create interior spaces, the easiest way to do that is to change the face normals. And what that means is when you're looking at a piece of geometry, a collection of vertex, edge, and faces, which side is visible? Because this object is not solid. It's vertices and its edges with faces. And so the faces are currently visible from the outside. Well, that's cool. If you want to create your world that way, that's fine. But there's an easier way to do that. And I will show you that. So when you have an object like this, okay, you can change the face normal so that instead of being a solid cube with faces on the outside, we hit F, which flips those. Now it's a hollow cube with faces on the inside, aka a room. Okay, so very quickly, if you create an object like this, by default, the surface, the face that you see visibly from the camera is on the outside. See, if I pop inside of here, so notice how it disappears. There's no face in here. It's on the outside. If I want to invert that, when I press the F key, which will invert faces or invert the face normals, now it's a hollow cube. Notice how there's nothing on the outside, but now it has surfaces on the inside, which is the basic building block of a room. So we're inside of a room. It's a pretty small one, but that's okay. So what I want to do before we do anything else is instantiate the player object. And so when you choose this tool, this is the entity tool. It has entity classes. These are all the classes that are available right now in the game engine. And it defaults to info player start. So if you want to instantiate an object, you just click, left click, boom, and it'll appear. Now be careful, because when you click, it'll create another and another, right? You only want one, and this is going to bite you later if you got a bouncy mouse button and you're trying to create something like a skybox. You don't want to create 5 of them on top of each other and not know it, because then you're going to be editing the properties on the one on top, and then the one on the bottom is going to be the one that's controlling the skybox. So just be careful not to create duplicates of objects that you don't want to use. So I'm going to go back to the select tool, object mode. Select this guy. I can move him around. Do not scale the player. It does not affect the world scale. I don't know why they let you scale him. I guess he's just an object, but you see I can move him around. He's in the world, and it's a pretty small room, but that's okay for the sake of this tutorial. We'll just leave him like that. So right now, if I were to compile this, build it, this is a level, and it's a plain, poorly textured interior box. But it is a world, and you can build this and submit it and have Cube World. Congratulations, no effort put into it. But that's not what we're going to do. I'm going to show you some of the basic manipulation tools you can use to create more interesting geometry. There's lots of crappy tutorials out there and a few good ones, but not very many that show you how this really works in real time. So the first thing we're going to do is get familiar with these selection options up here. This basically determines when you click something in the world, what does it grab? Is it grabbing a face? Is it grabbing an edge? Is it grabbing a vertex? Okay, so you got vertices that comprise the coordinates. You've got edges that define the lines that connect the vertices together, and you got faces made up by polygons with a face applied to it. So object mode lets you pick entire objects like the player or this whole cube, and then apply properties or manipulate it as a global thing, right? Faces and edges allow you to manipulate subcomponents of those objects, which is what you're going to spend most of your time doing when you're creating new geometry or new shapes or faces. So in faces mode, there's a tool you can use to subdivide this face into something useful, because you can't just draw on this like you could in SketchUp and extrude some 2D section into a 3D geometry. You can do that, but you have to do it a very unique way to keep the engine happy. So what we're going to do is cut this face. We're going to hit C for cut. And you notice I have a little line. It's snapping to the grid, but it tries to guess based on which edge I'm closest to where I want to start my cut, and then based on what plane or face the mouse is touching where that line should travel. So if I wanted to make a window here, for instance, I could take and cut. So we left click to start the cut, left click again to end the cut, or hit the next vector of it. And even though this is floating around, I've got my cut defined. I hit enter and it commits. And you notice now this face has an extra edge. I can do the same thing here. again, working off the grid to keep things stable and consistent. And then I'm just gonna kind of cut up a little window here. It's not gonna be in a great spot, that's okay. So we've got a window defined, or a shape that we can use to create a window. One of the things you can do, for instance, is click this. See how these are now individual faces? I can click this face and simply say delete, and now there's a window. There's a hole through the geometry that you can look through. But obviously it's not very pretty, and it doesn't look great. So we can add detail, again, using the cut tool if we like. But you notice how I can't cut real tight? That's because the grid setting by default is set to 64. That's pretty large. So you can adjust the grid either by clicking here manually, or you can use the bracket keys to adjust the grid. So for instance, if I wanted the grid to be 8 units, I can go down by hitting that bracket and it will adjust it. Now I can move in a finer detail without violating the grid, but it allows me to get a little bit more detail. So we'll click here, and you can keep clicking and drawing sort of a polygon as long as you like, as long as you stay on the same face. And then when you're done, just make sure you hit enter, which will commit that cut. And then I can click these individual faces. Which brings me to the next point, which is that you can select multiple things within a class. So if you've got faces or edges within that class of entities, by either clicking and dragging like a marquee, or by left click, hold down shift, you can left click again, add. Oops, if I didn't want to grab that, I can hit control. Notice that turns to a minus, and unclick it. Okay, so once that's selected, this widget for manipulating that surface now represents the whole group, and it tries to center itself there. You can, just like you could with tools like SketchUp or Autodesk, you can extrude and push these faces around. Let me show you what happens when you push a face. Okay, pushing the edges and the vertices, and notice how it's distorting all of the geometry in this room. Don't really want to do that. I mean, I don't want to do that right now, but I mean, maybe you do. You can use this to manipulate how your whole model is working and create some interesting shapes pretty quickly. For the purposes of showing how to quickly create geometry, let's do an extrusion. The way we do that is, instead of just grabbing this and moving it, which we don't want to do, we're going to hold down shift first. And what that tells us to do is create new geometry as I drag. So now that I'm holding down shift, I've got the little plus sign. When I click on this now and pull it towards me, look what it did. It created a frame. In the same way, this face up here, I could subdivide that and create the top part. You know, if I wanted to, I can cut these, you know, to create that piece that's missing. Enter. And then I can, again, in face mode, grab that little face, shift, click, and pull, create the rest of that window frame. Now it's a little big. This guy's kind of small, but we'll fix that in a second. But look, we have a basic window frame. And just like with faces, you can grab edges and push them around. I'll make my grid a little bit smaller just to illustrate. If I wanted to create a bevel there, you know, I can do that. I can grab this edge and bevel it. One thing you'll run into, obviously, is you're grabbing a single edge like that. You might run into issues where, you know, you distort your geometry like I just did. You can click again and select multiple faces, so that when you're doing those sort of transform operations, you're grabbing all the relevant geometry, so that when you move it, it moves predictably the way you want it to. So now, say I created an angle there. You know, I can pull it out, raise it up, see how it distorts and changes. So you got to get used to what is the object type that you're trying to manipulate and access. So I'm in edge mode. If I click on this face, nothing happens. I have to be in face mode. And it seems a little tedious at first, but it helps you to be precise in what you pick in your 3D view, so you're not fighting with perspective to get the right thing. Anybody who's done any kind of level design knows it's a pain in the butt sometimes to get the right little vertex or line that you're trying to get. So this helps you kind of narrow it down so that you're not selecting things you don't want to. And again, any edge, any vertices, any face you can grab and manipulate to help create more complex shapes. Like if I wanted to create a bevel here, you know, I could run my grid way down, and then I could precisely move that vertex to create a bevel. Or I'm sorry, that edge. So that's the basics of creating some geometry. One of the other things that you notice, the scene is textured with a default texture. It's not actually a texture, it's a material. And the way the source engine works, it's physically or property-based rendering. So it's going to render this based on the material properties. And the default materials that you're using for development stuff are pretty simple. This is the one you'll see in a lot of the tutorials that people are using. you can it does help provide a better reference, especially when geometry is uniformly colored, where you get a sense of what things look like. For instance, that's probably what you've seen in a lot of tutorials, and it's not bad. I'm not a huge fan of it personally, but to each his own. So anyway, materials are defined in your asset browser. So we fired up the Hammer geometry editor. The asset browser is another window that stays up. And what this asset browser shows you is all the materials and objects that are a part of this mod, this folder that you created when we created this. So we created one called tutorial. So I'm going to do this real quick and show you what that folder structure looks like. So within the Steam, your normal Steam apps folder, whatever that environment variable is set to on your computer, SteamVR, tools, environments, content, then there's a bunch of subfolders. So when you created that new mod, it created a folder here with the same name. And inside this folder will be any maps that you create once you save them, any materials that you define. And this way you basically keep your mod contained, so you don't bundle a bunch of textures or map or information or other files that are not necessary for your mod, so you can keep it a reasonable size and functionally coherent. So in order to put materials into your environment that you're creating, you have to put them either in this folder or in the root. So I have a bunch of mods on here that I've been playing around with. For instance, this one's a model of my basement. And if I take this material and stick it inside the folder that we just created under materials, paste, boom, there it is. Okay, see how it showed up here? We've got concrete as a material now. If I want to apply that material to this face, it should load it, load that texture and replace it. So if we pick the active material, you can search by typing in these fields, concrete, this, except I should be able to apply that material. Now here's a problem. My texture is defined with an image that's not present in this folder, which is why it didn't work. So you have to be careful. The best way to get materials into your map environment, especially if you're working with new textures and things like that, is to use your asset browser. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. Okay, you want to use your asset browser to define new materials and then go from there. So we'll open up, there's the Hammer editor, which is this big mesh map editor, and there's also the material editor. And so when you pull this up, blank page, you want to say like new material. One thing that's important is keep all the files that you're using in the same folder as your mod. So for instance, I'm going to look and grab these two texture files, right? I'll copy them and I'll stick them in that folder. Remember, Steam Tutorial 2 materials. We'll throw it in here. Minimize this and go back to the material editor. Okay, so in here, we created a new material, but it's nameless, it's unsaved, so we're going to say save, and then we're going to stick it in materials, and see the extension is V material. So this is more than just a picture, it's actually a material definition with lots of XML properties and things that define how the engine should treat it. We're going to give it a name, we'll call this one wood. Save it. Okay, preview not available, you need to save. So go ahead and save. Right now it's nothing, right? We need to define it, what it is. We'll give it a texture. So it says preview not available. So this is one thing I've run into. This engine seems a little funny about this. I did save it in the predefined materials, but you notice how it's complaining about it. What I've had to do many times is create objects within the main folder here, like in this root. So we'll try that. There, save. You need to save it, so we'll save it. Save to disk. Now we're going to open a texture. Yeah, isn't it funny how you're streaming stuff live and then it stops cooperating? All right, let's do this again. We'll start over here. All right, so let's start over fresh. We're in this folder. You notice how it started previewing and pulling things up. I probably just wasn't waiting long enough. But anyway, we'll do it in the root because that seems to be working more reliably for me. So again, material editor, we'll create a new material. We're going to save it, which will define a name. We're just in the root here. Call it wood. Save. So, okay, so notice we get a preview, 3D preview. Right now, there's nothing there but a color. And you know, you can do that. You could have just a color and then define a normal map, like what used to be called a bump map, to give it texture. And you can also, in this color section, this is where basically the surface imagery is represented. So we'll click the folder icon. We need to make sure our textures are in that folder. Copy them there. Paste. You notice how it's created that wood VMAT. Okay. Now we'll change to all images. Make sure we're in the root there. Pick wood.jpg, which is the image texture, and it'll create a preview here. You can use the mouse to manipulate this and see how it looks in 3D space. You should also be able to do a cube for a flatter texture. So there you go. It's pretty plain. It looks like a photograph pasted onto a cube. Another thing you can do, because it's using physically based rendering, like property-based rendering, is define normal maps and like gloss maps and stuff. So I'm just going to do a quick normal map. And if you're not familiar with it, normal map is a piece of imagery that looks like it's basically every engine's a little bit different in terms of what they expect, but this basically defines surface relief, and there's special meaning for each color and the value of each color that determines, you know, vectors and displacement and things like that. But you can generate these easily using tools like GIMP that are free, and it'll basically create a surface texture instead of just being a flat image. Now your geometry doesn't change, it's just the way it renders it gives the illusion that it has more complex. So I have that file saved, normal map. I'm gonna open it, and notice how this got bumpier. It's subtle, right? But it makes it look like it's got some more depth and relief. It creates some shadows and contrast. So you can use that to create more realistic textures, and you'll see that especially as you start putting in more contrasting lights, that those textures will really start to pop now. So now that we've got our texture and a normal map defined, you can play with these other settings. I'm not going to for the sake of this tutorial. Just save it. Once it's saved, you can go ahead and exit this material editor. Now we'll go back to Hammer, and in faces mode, we'll pick this face. We'll hit Control A to select all faces in the level. Right click. Now, sorry, we're going to pick in the material that we just defined, which should be in here, wood. There it is, accept. Now, whatever your active material is, any object that you create will take on that material property. So texture, normal maps, any other attributes you define in terms of its reflectivity or things like that. And so we're going to right click and apply material. Now this whole thing just turned into wood. But you know, this textures look kind of funny. It's not scaled right. This window over here, while we still have all this selected, lets you scale and change the texture, the way it's applied to the surface. So I am not a texture artist. That is an art, and there are people that are quite good at it. I am not one of them. I'm learning still. But in general, it's a little hard to see. I hate that they do this, but it keeps that highlight yellow on there, and it makes it difficult to really tell, especially with super fine textures. But you know, you can play with the spacing, you can play with the alignment, you can rotate it, and you know, give yourself a headache. But basically, you're going to have to manipulate the textures, and you can do this surface by surface. So if I want the ceiling to be a little bit finer, I can use just the ceiling and scale it. Again, when I'm in face mode and selecting things, it's only going to select faces, and you have to be in faces mode to deal with textures in this particular engine. So there's the roof. You know, we've got the walls. We could do the floor a little bit differently. We'll scale it a little tighter, maybe. That's bigger or smaller. Make it smaller. That's probably too small. But you get the idea. You can manipulate the scale and the spacing, rotation, whatever, to make it look the way you want. Okay, so now it looks like a crappy parquet floor, which is fine. And it's a window. So we got a wooden shack with a window. Right now, the environment, you know, is this void with a cube in it that your guy is standing inside, and the engine's perfectly happy with that. You can have arbitrary geometry. It doesn't have to be manifold, meaning your level doesn't have to hold air. Like years past, engines had to do that. So it does make it easier, especially if you don't want to spend painstaking hours trying to figure out where the leak is in your map, where it won't compile. But you do have to think a little bit more about, okay, so what's visible beyond this window I just created? Is it void? And that's where objects like skyboxes come in. So let's do that real quick. Let's define a skybox for this level. And so we've done geometry. We've instantiated the player using the entity tool. In the entity classes, you can look through this list. There's a ton of them, and it would take you a long time to understand them all. One we're going to use right now is environmental one for sky. So type sky, it does the, it'll search for partial matches. It's pretty good. You can find stuff quickly. So env sky, and then we're going to single click one time. We got to be careful here. One time, and that's going to create that skybox environment. And notice now we have clouds outside. That's an object, so I can click on that object. I can transform and move it around. Its position in the world does not matter. All it has to do is exist. And we can modify its properties in the object properties window down here. And that's where you would choose your skybox texture. This one uses cube maps, this engine, and it comes with some default materials that are pretty good. If you want to do something custom, it's a lot of work, but it can be done. So I'll just pick one. This is not great, but we'll pick it. And you'll notice now we have like mountains and sky partially visible through the window. That actually might work out because you won't be able to see over that edge. But as long as this is in the world, then you'll have a sky. And the sky does influence lighting. Anything that can see, any surface that can see the sky can be illuminated by the sky. And it does, I don't want to say ray tracing, but it does do ray tracing when you bake the lighting. So it'll try to figure out, based on the light that would be coming from a sky that's that color and that intensity, how the surface would be lit by that. And it's a subtle effect, but it does help add some realism in terms of giving you a balanced match between your sky and the objects that are visible to it. But we've got our basic level. We need one more thing, though, I think, to make it, not terrible, or less terrible, I should say. And that is to create some lighting in here, because the default full lit just looks terrible. If you add some lighting to it, however, you can create some more dynamics and make it look a little bit better. Two ones that you want to be concerned about really to begin with, and that would be the omni or the spot. Omnidirectional just creates a spherical light. A spotlight projects a cone, and you can adjust the geometry of those shapes and cones and ranges. We'll do a spotlight to begin with, and we're in the entity tool. We've picked a light spot. Wherever I click, it's going to instantiate that. And now notice how the lighting changed. Now it's dynamically trying to figure out, well, we're not just using environment light. We're not uniformly lighting. We got an actual light object, so let's try to calculate it. And it does a pretty good job in real time of calculating where those lights will go. But again, we're in object mode. This is an object. You can rotate, manipulate, transform, do all those things to get it pointed where you want, right? So two big tools that you want to use all the time in this engine are the transform and the rotate tools. T for transform. Any object that you have picked that supports transformation that way, you can then transform. You'll get this little widget that you can click on. Rotation, same thing. It'll create a sphere of, to give you a reference where you can click. And there you go. Now we can rotate it. So I'm going to actually position this so that it's like just outside the window maybe. So you get some occlusion. You notice how it's creating shadows. And this is kind of one of the ways you can help build realism. Lighting is critical. Materials are important, geometry is important, but lighting is also critical to get realistic. So if the sun's, up here somewhere in the sky map, it's not really in the right place. Let's fix that, okay? I'm going to take objects. I'm going to select everything in the world. We're going to rotate that whole assembly so that the window's kind of facing the sun, maybe. That because we rotated the skybox, perhaps. Yes. Okay. Let's rotate the skybox so that the sun is kind of out the window. So I'm going to put myself in the window where I can see out, and I'm going to try to grab this and rotate it so that the sun is visible through the hole. Now, when I put my light in the right place, it should. I'm going to hit T for transform. Should be able to move it, or translate rather. It should basically approximate the location of the sun. That camera will disappear, but its effects will remain visible. So now we've got shadows being cast by the window opening. We've got some light coming in. And when we look out, the sun's right there-ish. Okay, so we're building some realism in our crappy little level. Now, at this point, we can build the level, we can bake the lighting, and then we can take it out for a test drive. So I'm going to go bake lighting, bake all lighting. And that goes by really fast when you only have 1 or 2 light sources. However, it does basically like a photon. It bounces light inside the scene, simulates it, and then figures out the illumination of each surface based on the lights that are placed in the object, the materials, the reflectivity, all that sort of thing. So that's the first step you want to do before you build. The second step, excuse me, all along you should be saving your work. It does do it periodically, but don't trust that. Notice it's going to stick this automatically in the correct folder under your mod, under maps. We'll hit save. We'll call this tutorial 2, keeping with the theme. Save. Okay, it's saved. Now we'll go File, Build Map, or you can press F9. We're going to build a full compile, and it's going to give us some log information. Right now, so the engine's up and it's rendering. I've got my headset here. I'm going to pick it up and move it around. Now, I've noticed this is kind of a glitch. Notice how we don't see any of our geometry as I'm moving this around? It's because it's a bug in the engine. What you have to do is take your controller and just teleport one time somewhere to some geometry. And typically, the whole world will appear and look right after that. So I'm going to do that real quick. But okay, so now I'm holding the headset. You guys are seeing the preview window, I hope. You can see we can look around. We're inside of our world. And you can see textures are dynamically lit. Looks like a little bit of errors there in terms of the way the geometry is working. But if I look out the window, which is too tall, let me stand up. You see the sun. So you kind of get the idea. And some of these lighting artifacts you see, that's some of the specular, weirdness. It's from the bump map and the weird angle that the sun's coming in. But that's it. I mean, you could basically have a basic world already. And what did that take? 5 or 10 minutes. And you can continue to build more complex geometry, add textures. And right now, you can put on your VR headset and walk around in this, which is so cool. You can experience it, see if the scale's right. And if I stand up and look, it feels like I'm in a tiny shack with a little window floating in the sky, okay? Which is, a stupid concept, but it gets the point across that you can make whatever you want and then go inhabit it and see how it feels, which I think is awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and set this down. We'll hide this window. If you close this, your whole thing's going to crash. So don't do that. We'll do this. We'll close the build window. It's pretty neat. So we've got this environment. It's saved. It's built. It's compiled. It's got light. We've got a player. By default, he can teleport any reasonably flat surface within it. And right now, you could upload this to the workshop as an environment, and somebody could download it and play with it. Or you could make it your SteamVR home. So let me show you how to do that real quick. Everything's cool here. We've saved and built. We're happy with it. Let's pretend. We can go ahead and exit Hammer. We'll go back to the asset browser. Now, in the asset browser, you'll see our texture files. We've got our wood material. And we also have the map, the VMap file, which is the actual mesh and geometry and all that stuff. Right now, this is a complete shareable game, so to speak, or map, so to speak. By default, if you've never used these tools before, it's going to have everything selected, right? So you'll see, this one's got 1,748 assets visible. If you try to submit this to the workshop, it's going to submit all of this crap, like some of this stuff, I don't know where this stuff came from, environments I've visited, whatever. It's all here. And if you create a workshop package from this, all that crap's going to be in there. So what you want to do is make sure you filter to only include the stuff that comes with your map, okay? The content, the unique content that you created, okay? So I've only got my add-on selected, and it's a much more manageable list. That means your upload side is going to be much smaller and more manageable for the people that want to view in your environment. All the default assets, especially if you use some of them, things like skyboxes, they'll evolve it over time, but they'll stay in the same places. You don't have to bundle and package up things that are included with the engine that everyone uses on every level. Like it's just part of the engine. So you don't need to bundle all that stuff again. So it's there. Once you have everything and you're happy with it, you pull up your map, it runs good, you've play tested it. You want to click this workshop manager, and the workshop manager is tied to your Steam account. And as long as you've signed their agreements and promised that all your work is theirs forever, they'll let you share it with the community. You want to create new, which is new submission. Give it a title, a description, a preview image, and you can just drag an image off your desktop in there and create something. Give it a name. It's a good idea to keep your conventions, you know. Okay. And then check on the themes and other things. These are stuff that people can check boxes when they're searching for new environments within the workshop community tools. They can say, I want to see something that's, art. I want to see something that's space. These are the tags that go with it. And then visibility just is, can people in the public see it, only your friends, or is this just hidden for your own amusement? Depending on what you make, you may want to choose those options. And then just click submit. What it's going to do, I'm not going to submit this because it's just a tutorial. When you click submit, it's going to compile a map, build it, it's going to upload it to the workshop. This could take some time depending on your internet connection and the speed of your computer. It's going to create pack files and then upload them to Steam's community servers. So I've had maps take as long as an hour to upload on my slow connection, 10, 15 minutes to compile, and some just take a few minutes. Something really simple like this won't take very long. But once you've done that, you're like, okay, what happened? Well, where'd it go? Well, it'll pop up a window and show you what it looks like in the workshop when it's done. And then you can subscribe to it, which is the model that they use in the community. If you're a subscriber to an item, then it will download that automatically and place it in the appropriate game directory, which in this case would be the Steam Tours folder. So on their hard drive, when they download your mod, it'll pop into here for them, and then they can open and access it and play around with it. So I want to show you real quick. I've only been doing this a couple days, but I've created a couple kind of test environments. So I'll pull this up and show you the first one I did. So be kind. So base 2, that's what it's called, base 2. Launched tools. So a lot of materials in here. It's going to load them. It takes a few minutes. Textures and weird stuff I created, just try to teach myself how to use them. I'll open up a hammer, and we're going to open up the map basement, which is inside this pack. So this is a model of the basement that I'm sitting in right now and recording. You see my tractor outside, it's funny. This is all created using Hammer. I didn't use any external tools like Blender or, try it as I said, I'm gonna learn how to use the engine, so I did. And this is basically, like, these are objects that I've created, simple shapes that have been extruded and stretched out and textured. I know some of the textures are terrible. I wasn't going for crazy realism. What I did do was create a one-to-one relationship between this stuff and my real-world space. So when I'm in VR and I reach out in VR and tap my controller against my desk, I hit my desk, which is useful, I think, and allows me to, have a chair, for instance, that I can sit on, and I don't have to, wonder and feel around while I'm blind and try to find it or invoke the camera and do it that way. So it's literally there. I could reach out and touch it. I can sit on it, which I think is cool. So, I mean, this is what you can do with a little bit of patience. Create textures, extrude geometry out of nothing, place static props that come with it and things to add some more interest to it. For instance, these objects over here, this is a photograph that I just snapped with my smartphone, without any fucks given about how it looked, and threw it onto a rectangle, right? And then I just drew some cuts and pulled the surfaces out to just give it some depth, a little bit of relief, so that when you're moving around, you get like the right parallax cues. And I know it looks like ass, but it's good enough to create the illusion. When you're wearing the headset and you're looking around, it feels like you're in the basement. It's kind of creepy, especially if it's nighttime. You put it on. Oh, now it's day. I thought it was neat, and that took a couple days of trying to teach myself how to use it and texturing and manipulating geometry and figuring out best workflows. Another one I created, I'll just show you briefly, was this was a really quick exercise. I just wanted to experiment with lighting to try to get more realistic lighting. So that's why this project is called Lighting. And you'll notice my asset list is a lot smaller. I actually could get rid of that. I'm not using that one. There's the geometry. I'll just double click it, open it up in the editor. So this is one I created in a couple of hours yesterday. And it's just a simple kind of wood hut surrounded by mountains with a starscape. If you look up here, there's some lights creating ambient. This looks silly up here, but down here, you can see the light filtering and kind of lighting the boards and self-shadowing, shadows on the ground, a simple skybox, some prop lights with some lights around them to add the interesting, cast shadows and illumination. And this took a couple hours, and it's very convincing when you're in VR. So if we say build and try to run this inside VR, I'll show you what it looks like inside the headset. Again, we have that weird teleport issue. Here we go. So in engine, when it's correctly scaled, this is very convincing. Like, you want to reach out and like set stuff on the railings and drop your drink, and that's not a good idea. But I mean, this takes very little time, especially once you get used to the workflow, and you can create a realistic kind of landing page. I mean, that's what these environments are for. It's a place to like load, put trophies and load your games from. And I think it's neat. And it didn't take very long to do this one. I liked the star field, and this is recycling. Everything here is recycled assets. The wood was recycled from the other map, and the skybox was one of the default ones. And it's cool. So you just use your imagination. So set the headset down here. So I mean, that's kind of my basic tutorial. I could do more, add to it if you guys have questions or if you're interested in this kind of thing. But that's kind of the short of it. One thing you want to get used to doing is repeatability. So I don't want to have to draw, 73 wood pieces, right? I can instantiate one of them, and then I can duplicate it, using the transform tools, shift, and move it. And that's a repeatable process. I can repeat that over and over and over, right, to build geometry. So there's tools that you can use to make your life easier, and that's part of just learning the workflow, learning the engine, and kind of what the creation workflow that works best for you. And you're going to blow stuff up. You're going to make geometry that doesn't work or doesn't make sense. Just don't get frustrated. Keep playing with it, and you'll get better and better. Just keep building stuff, and the more you practice, the better you get. Anyway, that's the basics that you need to get started, to get going. Just some tips to remember. Always, bake your lighting, build your map, save often. When you upload it and you're looking at your assets, make sure that the assets are filtered only to include what's in your mod. Notice how I've got it selected, nothing but what's in this particular mod. And then this upload is now like 18 megabyte instead of the 300 the first one I did was, that didn't work anyway. So I don't know if we talked about, did we talk about creating materials? Yeah, I think we did. So we create materials. There's a model editor, particle editor. You can do other effects. I have not played with that yet. I'm going to, but for the sake of creating a simple environment with mesh, your geometry, your materials, lighting, player info, spawn, that sort of thing. That's all you need to get something started. And you can do a hell of a lot with these tools. As you saw for the basement, that was, rank amateur, using nothing fancy, and made a believable, useful construct in, a couple of hours of real, honest working time. So that's all I wanted to show you. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I find this stuff kind of interesting. I'm not going to save and screw this up. It's a lot of fun to create creations, in 3D space, and then be able to go walk around them. There's tons of good tutorials out there on the internet. I hadn't found any that were accurate to the current state of the tools. So that's why I wanted to do this, because I kept looking for buttons that weren't there and looking for tools that didn't exist anymore. And so it's really simple, but that's what you have to do to make it work. So I hope you enjoyed it. You guys take care. Comment, rate, subscribe. Let me know what you think.